Thank you to Jolie Hackney for her exceptional organizing skills and her amazing posters and her ability to be on time and to get things in order. She's amazing and we're going to miss her when she graduates. I wanted to start by saying that the title of my presentation today is really more of an FYI for students who don't really know what we do in terms of research. And so what actually do we do? I have a question. Are they able to see me too, or just?
Yeah, they can see you.
One of the things I had mentioned in the description for this is that students think of professors as teachers, but we also have a really thick research agenda and also service. And for me personally, I wind up getting further and further behind in my research. And so the sabbatical gives me a chance to do a little catch up. So I'm going to be juggling three things because the three projects I'm going to discuss are late. They're years late. Two of them are revise and resubmits. And what that means is when you submit something for publication, you're going to receive some revisions. R&R, revise and resubmit. So your reviewers will suggest this and that, A, B, C, D, and then you have a certain amount of time, you put those revisions together and you resubmit. But I never had a chance to do that in two papers. So I've got two outstanding papers. And the third is a project that I've only just started and that I'm writing about now. So when I was preparing this presentation, it became clear, it helped me to mobilize my own thoughts and to realize that I'm going to be juggling three things, and in many ways theoretically and empirically I now see that the last 10 years I've been backing out of, or let's say putting layers on the onion rather than peeling off the onion. It's like I'm getting to a larger theoretical onion skin that is able to, I think, enclose this larger set of projects. So I'm going to ask people to kind of hang on to maybe 4 or 5 different things simultaneously. The first is looking at the relationship of capitalism, mechanization, automation, and falling fertility rates. And I have been trying to develop an argument that both the machines and markets are not so much exploiting labor as extracting surplus from the bodies of what I call the maternal. And so mechanization, as we look over the last 100 years, from the 1801 to the end of the 19th century in England, and then the same kind of time period in the US, we see fertility rate declines in half. And usually people explain that away by talking about, there's greater educational opportunities and people want to get educated, or there are all these kind of secondary explanations for it. But nobody really looks at how mechanization and automation, although it helps increase production and labor is there initially to kind of see that forward, at a certain point, you don't need as much labor and it becomes a burden. So this is just, before I start, what is sabbatical leave? Because a lot of people consider sabbatical and paid leave the same. It is. There's really no difference, but it's every 6th or 7th year we get to take a professional leave with pay, and usually you have to assume tenure before you can get that, which is usually your 6th year, or if you come in with credit, you can the equivalent of the 6th year. You have to apply to the provost, who's the kind of head of academic affairs, and then the amount paid to you varies by the amount of time you take off. So usually the upper limit, the normative upper limit, there are larger ones. If you take off a full year, you get 50% of your pay. If you take off 1 quarter or 1 semester, it varies, but in a quarter situation, you get 100%, and 2 quarters, 66%. So typically people apply for grants to kind of fill in that amount that you're not going to get unless you're taking 1 quarter where you get 100%. So as this is from Jolie's poster, these are the 3 things that I had wanted to do to catch up. I had done a study of silicone sex dolls in Japan, but I'm interested in doing more comparative work on the silicone sextile industry in China and the US, and I'll go into that more later. As I mentioned, that was drafted for a journal plenary. Journals will sometimes sponsor plenary talks, and at our national association, they did that. The journal Dialogues in Human Geography had a plenary at the Association of American Geographers. So while I gave the plenary as a presentation, it wasn't actually, and then I submitted it, it was never revised. And the same with the second here, which is looking at the power of Western cosmopolitan elites to shut down a dog livestock industry for the rural poor by threatening to expose the initiative to the international community prior to the Beijing Summer Olympics, a kind of global shaming. And then the third is document and theorize the maternal as an early human ontology that circulated through sculptural art and ritual. So we're gonna kind of leave those. I'm not going to go into the rest of that third one. So I'm going to start by just looking at global sextile and fembot production. And okay, so this is global sextile fembot production. And as you can see, it's a northern production phenomenon. There are several main producers. The first and most important one is Real Doll in California, but there's a corresponding one in Japan called Orient Industries. They opened up within like 6 months of one another. And then there are all these other outliers that have come into existence since then, and most recently China. And there are some really interesting things going on in China. So if we blow those up a little bit more, you can see that California has got quite a number of these production facilities, and you can see that the special economic zones have also been a place of the newest production of these dolls. So China's come into it very recently, like in the last not even 10 years, and they're responding to demand. And there are some very interesting differences in the kinds of markets for each of these that I'll get into in a bit. And these are the retail outlets. So, Japan, China, Turkey, Indonesia, Australia, it's much more widespread, but it's still largely a northern phenomenon. So the market for these dolls and the production of these dolls is really culturally specific. So in the US, this is Real Doll Stacy. They have a huge number of what you would call customizables. So you can customize the hair, breast size, nipple size, eye color, height. There are so many different ways that you can customize these dolls. And in the US, you have a really extensive menu of different racial categories, of different age categories, and increasingly more that are targeting like anime and kind of fantastical. Still, the majority, probably 90-95%, are for white heteronormative purposes. There's a growing number of male sex dolls for gay men, and white women still make up a very small minority. Lesbians, I think it's really beyond statistical minimums. So you can see, I'm going to show you the next slide is a slide of the dolls that are being produced out of China. Now, this one is what they call silicone sex doll, hyper-realistic silicone sex doll. They're about $6,000, $7,000, which actually isn't bad. It's less than a car. People have relationships with them. They've done studies, both informal and formal, that indicate the majority of the men have relationship problems, are not married. And so for me, as a scholar, I want to understand what are the structural conditions of their making, emotional, economic, what's going on. And I'm going to be tying it to mechanization and market formation, and it's going to be something we're going to have to travel before we actually find anything to be sutured. So in China, they decided, like many things in the special economic zones, they were going to get economies by both raising the scale of production and also cheapening it. So they came up with TPE, which is a thermoplastic elastomer, and they don't have the same level of customization. and they don't have the same level of modularity. So if you look at Stacy's face, when they're making these, they're hand painting them. There's a lot of quote unquote artisanry that goes into this. And a lot of the pieces on here you can take off. In the Chinese case, they make them as all one piece, and they use this cheaper thermoplastic elastomer, which apparently smells really bad, but it's $1,000 to $2,000 cheaper. So you see on the chat rooms, people suggesting ways to get rid of the smell, put lots of baby powder on it. You know, there are ways you can work with the cheaper doll that still gets you the size that you want and the utility function, but it's not going to be the same level of artisanry. The Japanese dolls also have the same level of artisanry as the US, perhaps even a bit more. I'm not going to show you those because that's a project. But in Japan, they only have, quote unquote, the Japanese race, or they have biracial dolls that would appeal to primarily white men in the United States. So they're Japanese-y look. The Japanese dolls emerged out of early sex doll production for scientists who were going to the Arctic for extended periods of time. Whereas the dolls that are coming out of California, real dolls, is coming more directly out of economic downturns. So here's the China hit doll. You can tell it doesn't quite have the same level of articulation of the limbs. So you can see, let's say the face, there's just a limited, you could already see the silicone kind of stretching there. There's not a lot of articulation of the hands. It's all one piece. And these you can get from Shenzhen and Guangzhou. Now, you're not going to be able to see this, but I wanted to give you a sense that, so these are all of the different companies that were in China. Now, the problem is that I submitted this in 2017. Well, there's 5 years. So I have to, in many ways, re-engage this material, find out the new centers of production because they're proliferating quickly. But you can see, the kinds of information that I'm trying to get from the actual sites, company and start date, where they're located, their price, body material. So you can see in the first one, Doll Suite, it's silicone, but the other one, Hit Doll, is TPE, so that's thermoplastic elastomer. And then you have head names, which names that you give to looks for, so you might have, Kayla, Samantha, Kathy, like these are the names that you would give. And then you have the modular and robotic options that are there that are at the time. This is 2017, so there's a lot that has happened since then, particularly in the Real Doll, which now has a whole virtual part of the company. So you can see when I talk about fembots, there's an integrated heating system and vocal capabilities. So if you want them to moan, you can actually put in a moaning module. And then there's an insertable or built-in vagina so that some of them you can withdraw. The Japanese ones, because of pornography rules, you can't have a vagina. They're called a uni-hole, so it's just one hole. And then you have to go to the Yakuza to actually get the insert that's like the vaginal insert. So it's a very complicated, more circuitous way of assembling that doll through because of the state. So I'm going to go to the next, just to give you a sense of, these are ones that are expanding into other areas, just so you get a sense that this is an area of innovation and an area of expansion. So we're getting Realbotics, which is from the US, the Real Dolls, but you're also getting franchising of brothels. So in Barcelona, Turin, Houston, Moscow, Unique Dolls in Finland, Germany, Austria. There's now things like, sex doll pornography. So there's a kind of diversification of end uses and also product diversification, and the emergence of different distributor networks. So I'm just looking at the first sex robot brothel that opened ahead of the World Cup in Russia. And her name is Madame. And she comes with 2 orifices that are temperature controlled, 5'4", 35 kilograms. She's sized with pleasure when she's touched. The doll can blink, is bilingual. It's able to talk dirty in either English or Chinese. And the Lumi doll provides other realistic dolls with flexible movement of their joints that allow you to fulfill all your fantasies. Usually that means that there's hip mobility. I just thought I would throw this in because this is when they were originally having the Crimea. And somebody, I actually gave a talk on this, and somebody was able to identify that doll. I think this is on the Russian side, but they have an inflatable doll sitting on the border between Russia and Crimea. So one of the ways I'm trying to theorize these dolls is, rather than just purely that they're a market and they exist, is to look at them in relationship to fertility rate decline, which I'm also relating to issues of mechanization and automation. So if we look at 1950 to 1955, okay, so you can see that this is 8 and over. And by the time we get to something that's kind of the medium level, like the United States, it's 2.25 to 2.5, there's still a lot. So we're looking at the majority of Mexico, Africa, large parts of South America, all across Asia, these very high fertility rates. And I didn't show you the one in between, but basically it's kind of in between these. But if you look below, these have all bottomed out. So we're looking at total fertility rates, which are the total number of children a woman will have throughout her life course, as dramatically declining. And so the question is number one, when we're looking at mechanization, we're not just looking at the replacement of labor or automation, we're actually looking at the replacement of the maternal function, which produces the labor. So that means that the maternal is going to be an idea that's going to disappear. So if we're looking at this instead of fertility, and instead we look at it as a factorial, as a factor of value for the maternal, it can also be seen as declining value of the maternal. And so what does that mean? That's one of the things I've been trying to work with is, what is the relationship of these dolls? Because if you have these dolls, they take up a lot of space. They replace, for the most part, research indicates that these people do not have long-term relationships or secure relationships, so they're not procreating. These dolls are essentially appearing in the place of procreation. So it's recreational sex, not procreational sex. And the recreational sex has investments that are far less than the investments you would put in recreational sex if you had it, on a vacation going to Barbados or wherever people go for the romantic getaways. So for me, the question is, how do we put together pure recreationality of sex dolls with falling fertility rates, and how is this all coming into to pass? So I'm going to back up a little bit and look at masculinity. So I'm looking at kind of early industrial capitalism with the really big steam engines, the beginning of the steam engine. And this is the double Corliss engine, this very phallic expression of power, industrial power, and largely whites at the base, kind of oohing and awing at this ginormous phallic double Corliss engine that is propelling and energizing a lot of the industrial landscape. And there's also, I would argue, a shift of understanding of conception from the womb to the head. The head becomes the place of laboratories and early on prefigured by the hall of cartography and libraries and what have you, that from which women are prevented from entering. So there's this kind of way in which the machine itself is seen as a site of conception, and the male head and the machine are kind of mapped onto each other in really complicated ways. We also see in some of the early films, I'm not going to go into Metropolis, but that's a kind of an earlier one, but this one is more looking at the playfulness that you can have with the machine. But nonetheless, people are kind of inserted into the machinery, but there's a very clear identification of the masculine subject. And in this case, I think Charlie Chaplin is also trying to poke fun at the fact that the biggest guy with his shirt off is doing the least amount of labor, because the machine actually feminizes the labor process in these kind of intense factory contexts, so that he can do a pirouette on the actual driver of this ginormous machine complex. And the man that is there with his shirt off, all he's doing is pulling levers. So Charlie Chaplin is kind of whimsically oiling this man as part of the machinery. And then, we start seeing this kind of wraparound of masculinity around the machine, of rigor, of might, of kind of fascination of the phallicism of the arm muscles. Even though, this is obviously, he's working with machines. It's very different from the assembly line, but there's some kind of lineage that gives them both some kind of masculine cachet. And then in the end, of course, we're going to get this labor that's kind of excreted from the system of production during times of crisis. And this is when we see, particularly after the 1973 oil crisis and the global economic downturn and deindustrialization, this is when we start to see pornography emerging. It starts to emerge in context of war earlier on, but this is when it really becomes systematized. It's when you start getting the first pornographic magazines. Playboy's an exception, but there are ones that are kind of piling on. It's also when you get the strip clubs, gentlemen's bars, art clubs. You start getting the peep shows, all kinds of things, because women, that ability to occupy the phallic position is no longer available. So instead, there's kind of an enclosure of the maternal, or, this kind of, the reason I call it maternal is because when you're thinking about, as I do from a psychoanalytic perspective, access to women, it's a very Oedipal, sexed in the context of industrial capitalism. So you're always one hair away from mommy, so when you're talking about you're cooing over your baby, your honey baby, and using all the food and all the images of children. And when you're trying to infantilize these women in pornography in order to kind of assert a paternal function, take care of, there's all this kind of mixing of infantilism and adulthood that is very fraught, and it's not clear-cut at all. So when you're looking at, I'm totally ripping this off. We're not going to look at it the way they want you to look at it, but I'm just going to imagine that these are women. We're not going to look at the context of it, but pretend these are the women of the laborers, and through mechanization, they're just being gobbled up. And with lower overhead labor costs, there's more money kind of walking out to the bank. If we go and look at that one where the labor redundancy, we're seeing this is when the first blow-up sex dolls in China emerges in the 1970s, or like 77. And we see all these pornographic enterprises emerging. They are, in a way, there to provide solace, to allow you to still occupy those photographs of the phallic men. And it's also when you're going to start seeing motorcycle, well, actually that happens after World War II, so we're going to leave that to one side. But what we're going to see is with this redundancy of the mother and child, we're going to see a relocation of capital to places, and I'm going to reformulate it with high fertility rates rather than saying reserve of labor. So where are those? Those are going to be in Mexico. And in China, it's because of the accumulation of those children. In 1979, Deng Xiaoping paired his one-child policy with an opening up to foreign direct investment, so those two would work together. He knew that if you're going to pour in investment, you want to have small families, so if you're earning a wage, it doesn't have to go across as many people. So we're seeing then a shift in where the maternal is located. So we can think then about how these places are going to be where the dolls are, and production is going to be in the place where there are still women producing children, although there's going to be a lot of tension, often because that labor force is going to be feminized, and there'll be kind of internal tensions and resentment towards women. This was just to give you a sense of the kinds of literature I've been looking at. You can see that when we're looking at, in almost every case where there's economic losses, white men are the ones that are most prone to suicide. And those who have long been on the bottom don't really change very much because they're used to being on the bottom. So in almost every case of an economic downturn, women's suicide rates remain like this and men's suicide rates go up. So this is just an example of one of those kinds of graphs that I look at. So you've got white men here, this is overall, and then look how far down it is before you get to men, right? But then even Black men are higher than Black women, which are here. So you're pairing it, here's white men, white women, and then here's Black men and Black women. So the people you would think have the most privilege and would be able to abide by these downturns are the ones that fall the furthest in terms of emotional. So again, I'm trying to think about not only is there falling fertility rates and a kind of the maternal itself is no longer having much of a role economically in terms of procreation, but you're also getting these downturns which are furthering these fertility rate declines, kind of pushing them even lower. And in the process of this, men are undergoing all kinds of crises related to their fall from, at one point in the United States, for example, having the family wage that was supposed to speak for the entirety. So, you know, I'm not even going to go into this part of it, but there's a way in which the body of the maternal is a rarity to begin with, but then you also have the rise of women coming into economic power. And you see that particularly in China, where because of the one-child policy, yes, there are more Chinese women being, or girl children, you know, femicide through abortions, but those that choose to keep those girl children, they're given the same level of investment as the boys were. So they are super excelling, which is causing all kinds of tensions within traditional Chinese culture, where men are now turning either to rural women, to women with lower education. Educated women are having a hard time finding partners. And this is where the sex dolls come in, because both in the United States and in China, the men that are gravitating towards these dolls are different. So in the United States, it's working class men, because these dolls, they're expensive, but this is their life partner. And when you go onto these chat rooms, they are thrilled with their dolls. They, you know, talk with them, dress them up. They can change their hair, their clothing, paint their nails. There's a lot of discussion about their relationships with these dolls. In China, the demography is very different. It's elite men who don't really find that they can relate to these women who are now also becoming elite. And so it's a way of, in both cases, bringing the old imaginary of what a woman is supposed to do back to life. So in the case of what I need to do with this project is I need to figure out some of the ways in which they are continually trying to innovate, because initially it was just with Japan, the unihole. They have one hole and that's it. One race, that's it. Now you've got the Yakuza from Japan setting up shop in Dalian, which is in the one of the northern special economic zones, and creating a larger menu of options that will allow them to make more money from this. So they're giving more racial options, but they're also having two holes. And they're having a larger kind of racialized set of customizables. So they're kind of avoiding the state restrictions and also avoiding the kind of racism of Japanese doll making, where Japanese men don't want a non-Japanese doll. So they're kind of, by relocating to the special economic zone, they've kind of broadened their production abilities or their markets. So I have to kind of research and find out more about the Yakuza in particular, and also more about the virtual technologies. So the guy that started the real dolls in the United States has kind of stolen a bunch of high-level engineers and material sciences people to come up with various ways in which you can make this super young feminine figure be with you. So you could have the equivalent of a Siri, who's an animated figure on your phone, who you could talk to and ask her about this or that. And she won't just be a voice, she'll actually be able to have a conversation with you. You can also link that technology to animatronics. So you could buy a head that is linked to what you want the figure to do virtually, and you can get them to correspond. You can also have virtual reality headsets where you can have different kinds of experiences with the same doll. There are all kinds of ways in which these are breaking out of the typical mechanical into things that are more tied to information technologies and algorithms and virtual reality and so on. So that's one of the balls that I'm kind of juggling. The second has to do with around 1980, the global market for dog commodities was under a couple $100 million. And now it's at least a couple $100 billion. So again, I'm interested in how are these falling fertility rates leading to reaching out for love. And a dog, the way that I'm theorizing it, is the only other life form other than the maternal-infant relationship that has evolutionary ties, where the dog and the human kind of evolve together, and the dog is super attentive to the human, not so much the other way around. It's an option, but the dog itself is very attentive. So how is the dog in late capitalism, this time of great, what I'm calling maternal alienation, filling the function of both being a kind of mommy, where you can dress it up and take it to a Halloween, it lets you do anything you want with it to kind of, you become the child with the dog. Or the dog, especially the small dogs, can become your baby so that you dress it up and, there's a kind of dietism or a kind of relationship that can reverse, where sometimes you're the baby and sometimes you're the adult, and sometimes they're your baby and sometimes they just let you, run right over them. And so I'm looking at the elaboration of this huge universe of commodities. And so I'm theorizing what I call the commodity dog. And the commodity dog is not only the dog body, but using the dog body as a kind of hanger for all of these myriad of companies and products and services that have emerged since the early 1980s. And anybody that thinks otherwise, anybody that thinks a dog should stay outside or maybe shouldn't wear clothes, there's an interesting tension because there are a series of people who have critiqued the super commoditized love affair with dogs based on kind of global poverty. But there are also those like the Chinese state, which after foreign direct investment was introduced in 1980 and began to kind of really take hold in the early 1990s, dog in China had been banned by Mao. It's a very complicated scenario because the early on, there were, when Mao had done the Great Leap Forward, where he was trying to set up kind of backyard factories, but also was competing with Russia on their grain production. And because of a series of very fraught local politics between the cadres and Mao, they wound up overestimating how much grain they were going to be producing. And in order for the cadres to cover their deficits, they would take what had been allocated to the peasants and bring that to Mao instead, which meant that people were starving. And so in the end, you have about 40 million people starving to death, and they ate all the dogs, so there were no dogs left in China. Then there's a couple of other times when dogs become completely eaten, but the one I'm going to focus on here is during the Cultural Revolution, when Mao's policies are not going well, and he decides that one of the ways you can distract from his real failings, economic failings, is to blame the bourgeoisie or the capitalist dogs living within, and so on and so forth. So he asks the Red Guard to eliminate all the dogs and cats. All the pets are eliminated, and then they weren't supposed to be there anyway. But they are now dragged out and they are killed publicly. They're seen as a kind of sign of, you know, the emperor had a little bevy of Pekingese dogs that become, that get smuggled out during the Third Opium War into England and are kind of transacted as a kind of political currency. And so there's all this association of the Pekingese dogs and all those small lap dogs with luxury, with squandering of resources away from the poor. So they were already not supposed to be there. But during the Cultural Revolution, they're flushed out. So when Deng Xiaoping comes to power, Mao dies in 76, Deng Xiaoping comes to power in 78, people are now thinking that they can push a little bit, especially since you're now getting the cultivation of a middle class. And so it's primarily these people who are given more privilege who start smuggling in dogs. And there starts to be this kind of subterranean dog population in China. And also there's the one-child policy, so the smuggling in of dogs is there in China, you know, really foregrounds how much dogs begin to take the place of the child. And what happens is that although they have periodic raids to kind of get rid of these dogs, the actual political might of these people is pretty large. And so in 1994, I think it's the year of the dog, the Beijing municipality announces it will now allow dogs to exist, by which time there's about 300,000 dogs in Beijing. But they don't have any way to take care of these dogs. There's nothing for, let's say there's rabies or you want to get rid of your dog or whatever. So these dogs start wandering all over, and there's just this huge dog problem that starts coming into post-socialist China. Now, all of the resources were being pushed into the cities and nothing was being put into the rural areas. And so rural areas are really suffering. And as we saw with the Great Famine, rural people are the ones that tend to eat dog meat more, but there are also regional variances. And there are places where they don't eat dog meat. It's a very complicated map of dog eating. And historical, because sometimes they ate dogs because that was the only thing they had to eat. So what happens is that they decide around the mid-1990s, right when they're also having the year of the dog and making dog ownership legal, that they're also going to set up a new category of livestock, and that's going to be the dogs. So the Ministry of Agriculture recategorizes the dog as a form of livestock. And then it sends ministry officials out into Europe to look at the largest dog breeding facilities they possibly can find. What I mean by that is like the largest dog breeding facilities. So Dobermans, St. Bernards, really big dogs, Pyrenees. And these scientists decide that the best dog that they think they could hybridize with the local northern Chinese dogs, which are really sturdy and people prefer their meat, is the St. Bernard. So they start shipping in these St. Bernards for the purposes of crossbreeding to create the perfect meat dog that could then be fit into a standardized dog meat industry that would totally be around rural people. Rural people would be taking care of the abattoirs, of packaging, processing, transporting. They had certain dog meat products that would be taken from facilities and driven out to airports for people wanting goodbye gifts. There were all these different things that were coming into being. The main basis of it were these base breeding sites where they would bring in these large dogs. And it's too complicated to go into. You usually need 3 or 4 generations to get a hybrid going, but it looks like they were taking shortcuts and they would just take a large dog and breed it once with a local dog. You can get a 50-pound dog in 6 months. And so the state started bragging about this amazing entrepreneurial activity that anybody in these rural areas could pick up. And it could make you a lot of money because these dogs grew faster than pigs, which is a major industry. Not only did they grow bigger, but they had a higher meat to bone ratio. So they were juicy. They had low overhead because one of the things about dogs, just like pigs, is they eat their own offal, their own excreta. So it's very energy efficient. So there are all these things. So the communist TV station in Beijing starts having these public service announcements saying, here is an amazing way for you to get a job. Here are these bases. We have all kinds of abilities for you all to be part of something that's going to grow into something amazing. So meanwhile, not too much longer after that, there's a Swiss woman who finds out about the use of the St. Bernard. And the St. Bernard is the national dog of Switzerland. So she sets out to shut down the industry because she sees it as this combining of racial purity to be used by Chinese people to eat dog, when it's like, why throw away a good dog? Like, how dare they use this really good dog plus the dog of the nation? So she sets into motion a very cosmopolitan campaign of St. Bernard breeders all over the world. And they get a campaign together to write against them continuing in this fashion. They submit it first to the Swiss Parliament, and they say, You have to talk with the Chinese government, state to state, and say that this is unacceptable, that you are eating our dogs, and that's our nation you're eating. And the Swiss parliament says, this is a cultural affair, and if you want to continue your work with these other nonprofits that are working with dog issues, you can, but that's not what we do. So then she thinks, okay, I'm going to go to the Olympic Organizing Committee. She knows that Beijing is they're about to make a decision on who's going to hold the Summer Olympics. This is for the Beijing 2008 Summer Olympics. So she goes to the head of the Beijing Organizing Committee and she says, this is terrible. I mean, how can you choose Beijing? And Beijing is not a really good international player. It's actually eating the national dog and kind of disrespecting a nation. So she doesn't know that that new head of the Olympic Organizing Committee has worked for years trying to get China into the running. It's going to be the first time that a communist China is going to be hosting the Olympics. So that doesn't go anywhere. So then she goes and she takes recordings that have been translated of that CCCP television, encouraging people to apply to work on these dog bases. And she threatens the ambassador who's in Zurich and says, Bern, and says, we will expose you and you will be the laughing stock if you go forward with this, because everybody essentially in the West loves their dogs, and you're going to go ahead and you're going to be eating dogs. It's not going to work. It's 1 week before they're going to make their final decision. And China shuts it down immediately. And then it, distributes information about no dog meat eating. And it literally disassembles some of the universities, the ag universities that had set up laboratories. They're gone. So rural people are very upset because this had started generating income, and there was beginning to be a vertically integrated from the actual bases to the processing to distribution and so on. And now it's gone. So the rural folk decide that they are going to continue it, the main problem being where are you going to get the dogs? Well, they're just going to steal them mostly from urban areas because that's the densest settled. And that would have worked, except that the urban dogs are purebreds from elites. And so when they start having these spectacular news stories showing a little Shih Tzu wearing a tuxedo coat with a tie on the abattoir floor, people just go up in arms. And in particular, the youth of China, elite China, the ones with phones and cars and so on, they decide they are going to do like a Robin Hood, where they have their phones, and if they see an illegal truck carrying crates of dogs, they will then have a network that they'll call. They'll immediately come onto the highway, circle these trucks, stop the trucks, unload the dogs, and sometimes pay the driver, who's usually a poor rural person. But now that person will never get hired again. They've lost all of the cargo. Who knows what's going to happen to them when they bring that truck back? The problem then emerges that these children of elites, where are they going to put these dogs? And so some of them they try to sell, or not sell, but give away because they're purebreds. But all the other ones, no one wants, because these cosmopolitans in this, elite context of Beijing, nobody wants a non-purebred dog. So all of their families' strata are disinterested, And then they have to either come up with money to start some kind of dog pound or put them out to rural areas. So I'm going to stop there because it just shows you the kinds of contradictions that are emerging, because while this is all going on, in Shanghai, they recently started a dog fashion show at one of the largest dog expositions. It's probably the largest in the world. But they just started the first ever dog fashion show. And so you've got these people that are really embedded in all of this, and then ostensibly trying to break down this rural endeavor, but the contradictions of the rural are kind of impinging on them. And then they're having to reemerge to kind of try to cover up what the rural are doing, but that problem still remains. And there are some other instances that I could talk about, but I think I'm gonna stop there. Yeah, so basically I'm just trying to look at how people are finding love, how people are finding sell clothes, perfume, shoes, medical, orthodontistry, like there's all these medical specialties, and it's becoming these new sites of consumption that you can sell to across the life course. To some degree, it's the same with the sex dolls, because you can buy different hair, nails. You're dressing up like this doll continually. And, you know, there's this attempt to kind of, they're looking for life in a context where fertility rates are falling. And by 2050, the planet is going to peak its population, and then it's going to go into absolute decline.
So we have some time for questions if you're willing to take them. If people have them, you can do the raise hand function. We're open to those. I have a preliminary, first I have a comment. You know, I've worked with or heard you speak about these things prior. And it's so interesting in so many ways. And actually, I think about specifically people have strollers for their little dogs even. And I know in my hometown, there's a restaurant for dogs specifically. So it's all very interesting, but I don't think I'd ever heard you make the connection so strictly between the dog industry and sex doll industry. So that was really interesting. And I'm wondering how much then you are focusing on the role of the state and state policies as they come up. And then sort of specifically for the sex doll industry, was there some sort of direct impact when the one-child policy was ended that you have studied at all in the context of the sex doll industry?
The ending of the one-child policy hasn't changed anything. Chinese people don't want more kids. I mean, once you know, no, it hasn't made a huge difference. Yeah. What was the other question?
Just sort of generally how much you focus on the role of China as the state implementing policies and those having or not having a certain impact on each industry.
The state is furious about the dogs. I mean, it's all the time trying to say nasty things about how bourgeois it is, and they really don't want the level of investment that they have there, but they also realize that they need to cultivate this class, and that's what that class wants.
Okay.
Because dogs are they're much better than children. I mean, you can move them around, you can dress them up. They're always happy to see you. You can get rid of them if you don't like them anymore. I mean, they're just so much more fit to operating in a kind of highly fluid environment.
I have a question.
Tammy, is that Alyssa?
This is Alisar. Hello.
Hi, Alisar.
It's nice to meet you. We have both been commenting on all of the little dogs that we see in we're in California, and there seems to be such a high number of little baby doggies. We saw maybe 3 people cradling their puppies this weekend, rocking them. And we went to a bar and there was dogs galore, and they're up on the table and they're getting into the food, and it's weird. Anyway, I was wondering if you see any correlations between that behavior and the sex doll production map that you had shown us. Are there correlations? Yeah, I guess I'll ask that question.
I think the dog is much more democratic. So if you're looking at the one-child policy, initially you could go to some of the there's like a regular market where you can get animals in Beijing, and they would buy these really expensive purebreds. Now this is back in 1990, around 1990, $6,000-$7,000 for purebreds that elites wanted. What also happened, and I need to sort out the story, is that with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, I'm not really sure if it was mafia who were somehow able to mobilize dogs from elites or how, but they were able to smuggle dogs on the Trans-Siberian Railway into China and then sell the dogs in China at a huge profit, because each one of those dogs would bring $5,000 to $6,000, right? So there's a way in which they were, after the fall of the Soviet Union, maybe people couldn't take care of their dogs, maybe there was a surplus of dogs, it's not really clear. That was another stream of people bringing them in. And the other was Hong Kong elites who would buy or would set people up in rural areas to produce the dogs and then smuggle them in that way. In any event, people of all walks, you could buy the $6,000 dog or the $20 dog. And then you had, rural dogs. So everybody had kind of access to the dog. And you see it filling these niches in terms of urban people, depending on how much you can afford, which is what you see all over the world. That's why the dog is so good at selling commodities, because somebody can get a really cheap dog for the pound, but you can still sell it a Halloween costume, right? So it's the way in which it's infantilized, because it's not really the body of the dog that's valuable anymore. It's the dog as a hangar for commodity goods and services. And you even get things like taking dogs that are brachycephalic, which means they have an overbite. And then there's a whole subfield within dog veterinary medicine of braces. So why would you have a brachycephalic dog and give it braces, right? So there's like all of these, or you make German Shepherds and they're bound to have hip dysplasia. So then you have specialists who work with hip dysplasia, but why are you breeding it anyway? But nonetheless, with all these breed concerns, but everybody can have a dog, anybody can have a dog. So when you look at the big box stores are emerging at a time when fertility rates are falling. And so you see these openings within the big box stores of just aisles of things for pets that were never there before. So I think the sex dolls are tied primarily to 93% of the market are primarily racially elite men who have lost their position vis-a-vis women, either because of the one-child policy, which has catapulted these women, or because in the United States, men lost their union wage jobs and women began entering the market. The same in Japan, where after the fiscal crisis of the early 1990s, Japanese women started going into the labor, into work. So, and they also started going on what's called a procreative strike. They just would not get, they did no longer wanted to marry men who were working in this old system of a 16-hour day, and they would be asked to take care of the children 100% of the time. So the doll is much more fraught in terms of, you know, it has a much smaller consumer base. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And also I wanted to comment and say that how excited I am to see you bringing all of these projects together. As one of your former students, it's great to see that you're still thinking through some of the similar threads, and I can't wait to read your next work.
So I have a follow-up question based on that. Have you looked at the way that you showed us sort of demographic data of sex doll ownership? Have you explored the same stuff for dog ownership?
Well, again, because dogs make themselves and they don't need to be made.
Yeah.
So you could get a mutt and love it to death and dress it up. Or like in San Francisco, you would see a mutt as even superior to a purebred. And then it gets more cultural cachet because it's not produced as a specialty item. But you can dress up any dog. That's why, you know, you look at some of the main tailors and the main centers of dog fashion in the United States. They're Dominican populations in New York. They're the ones that are babying the dolls. They're making frilly little dresses for it. I mean, it's a major site of entrepreneurialism because it's the new child. I mean, it's the thing that's easiest to love in a world where children have become unaffordable. Human beings are, you know, so highly hypermobile. And we see that even in terms of making the dog easier by either the mechanical dogs or virtual dogs, or like there are all these other things, because it's really about convenience. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I will say though that one of the things I didn't talk about, which I'm going to be writing about, is historically Tibetan Mastiffs were made by Tibetan monks. Very, very important dogs and rarely made. And then Chinese elites started, wanted them. And so these Tibetan monks began a breeding program specifically for that urban clientele. And they would charge $10,000 a dog, $10,000 a dog. Many of these monks left their monk habits and became kind of full-time breeders. That lasted for maybe a year or two, and then the dog fashion changed, and nobody wanted those Tibetan Mastiffs anymore. So now you've got all of these monks set up in Mastiff production facilities, and nobody's buying. These dogs are massive, and they eat a lot. So there's two things that happen. One is the monks just let them out into the wild, and they become feral. And now they're a real problem killing people because they're attacking and mauling and eating people because they don't have anywhere to go. They're in large numbers. Or, and you can Google this, you can look up, they have corralled these mastiffs into these ginormous enclosures. I don't even think they're spayed and neutered. And they just live there. I think people just like throw food in there. I mean, I don't know exactly what it is, but they're just like reserves of surplus populations of mastiffs. And it's pretty appalling, which again shows you there's this valuing of the dog, the babying of the dog, this supposed, rescuing of the dog. But then it's not in fashion anymore. And then you're left with the body. And what do you do with that body that's no longer in fashion? Pretty amazing, right?
Wild.
It's wild.
I have a follow-up question there, but I want to make sure no one else's hand is up. Okay. I'm curious if you could talk about if any insights around geriatric dog attitudes have come up in your work, since we're talking a lot about infantilization. I'm wondering how the opposite end of life is treated, and if yeah.
I mean,
Go
the
ahead.
thing is that, again, there's an anthropomorphization because pharmaceutical companies don't really know how dogs feel pain or do not. So, for instance, when dogs were having to deal with living in cities after elites started coming back from the suburbs and inhabiting the core of cities and had to be in apartments, and prior to there being dog parks being made for in areas, these dogs would be locked, and sometimes they wouldn't have any of the diurnal rhythms of the environment, like the sun and whatever. So they would start gnawing on food, on chairs, and tearing up sofas and kind of going crazy. And so the first psychotropic that was used to kind of cure that problem was after World War II, they were using dogs to test antidepressants on humans. And they were able to go back to the testing on the dogs to actually see if it worked for the dogs, and then to extend the patents by reissuing the patents for dogs. So this was, the one I'm thinking of was called Reconcile, which is a terrible name because it was meant to make the dog STFU. It's like, you gotta reconcile. But it was a human, I can't remember the drug. It was a really common human. It was like a Xanax wrapped in bacon. So can you go back to that question again? Because I was on my way to answering it.
The question was around the geriatric dog.
So what I was going to say is that the medicalization happens first with respect to these dogs going crazy. I mean, you've put them in environments where they're not supposed to be there, and then you want them to be with you all the time because you have such high levels of emotional need that you're making them go crazy. So the next thing, though, is this huge explosion of veterinary subfields, and they no longer can find, there's big veterinary people and small veterinary. The big ones are like the cows and the horses, and they can't find anybody anymore because the money is in the small urban pet markets. And of course, then there's all these downstream and upstream things. So you're going to have cancer hospitals for dogs. So they're going to do all kinds of radiation and chemotherapy, and convalescence homes, and there's going to be all kinds of, again, this commodity dog is replacing in two levels. One is the level of production of goods for consumption, because if you've got a falling fertility rates, your profit margins are going to sink unless you can find alternative sites of life to which you can sell things, or intensify the amount that an individual can purchase, which then is tied to all kinds of other logistical problems. So it's an explosion. Geriatrics, you've got dogs on dialysis. They're making dogs live to 14, 15, 16 and saying it's for their benefit, but I don't know. I mean, they don't know how dogs feel pain, and if a dog is not saying anything and is limping around and looks at you and you think, oh, it's just loves me, you have no idea. It could be in excruciating pain if it's not healthy.
All right, well, if we don't have any further questions, we could call it a night. But I want to thank Dr. Nast so much for giving this talk. She, I always say, is brilliant. As the current student going on graduate student, I am in such admiration of how you think through things and make these connections. And I, similar to Temi, cannot wait to continue hearing about it from you and reading about it.
Thank you, Shelley.
All right.
And thank everybody.